In the summer of 82 AD, a young woman named Aelia Varra was led through the streets of Rome. She was 22, the daughter of a respected imperial accountant, educated, composed, and until that morning completely invisible to history. Her crime wasn't murder, it wasn't treason, it was speaking too freely at a private dinner about the emperor's divine status. Someone at that table reported her. In Rome, truth could be dangerous, but mockery was unforgivable. Within a week, Aelia's father was stripped of his rank. Her family's estate was confiscated, and Aelia herself was sentenced to something Rome considered worse than death: public humiliation. To the Romans, this was a form of purification, a way to burn arrogance from the body through shame. It was justice, morality, and entertainment all woven into one terrifying ritual. The crowd gathered not out of hatred, but out of a sense of duty. This was how society cleansed itself. They came to watch what happened when a citizen's dignity was torn away, and when the empire itself through spectaclery minded everyone who truly ruled. Aelia was paraded through the forum, wearing what used to be her wedding veil, now dyed black. Her wrists were tied with a red cord, the color of blood and disgrace. A sign hung from her neck, reading, "She spoke against the gods." She wasn't to be executed, she was to be exhibited. The punishment would take place in the Campus Martyri, the same field where Rome trained its soldiers. Because in Rome, punishment wasn't hidden in dark dungeons. It was displayed in the very spaces where virtue was supposed to live. This wasn't chaos, this was order. Rome believed that public shame could hold society together better than any sword. It was law, psychology, and performance all working in perfect sync. The Romans called it exemplum the example. One body made to suffer so that millions could remain obedient, and Aelia was about to become that example. But her story wasn't unique. It was the story of an entire system, one that perfected the art of destruction without spilling blood. A system built on ritualized humiliation, administered by law, sanctified by religion, and performed as entertainment. Rome didn't just rule through armies, it ruled through the fear of disgrace. And for women like Aelia, disgrace meant erasure. Her silence would not save her now, because the most dangerous thing she ever did in Rome was to speak. Aelia Varra's punishment was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the result of a precise and ancient system, a machine built to control the living through ritual, law, and spectacle. The Romans didn't invent cruelty, but they industrialized it, transforming punishment into administration. In most civilizations, a crime led to punishment behind closed doors, but Rome believed in visibility. Justice, to them, only existed if it was witnessed. That's why executions, floggings, and ceremonies of shame were performed in public squares, in circuses, in open fields. The city itself was the courtroom, and the crowd was both judge and accomplice. Rome called this concept pona publica, public penalty, and it was as important as the army or the Senate, because no empire, no matter how vast, could rule forever through force alone. Force needed to be seen asterisks to remain feared. This was a civilization obsessed with hierarchy. Every person had a status: citizen, freedman, slave, and when punishment was delivered, it was always calculated according to that rank. A blow to a slave's back was cheap. A senator's humiliation, however, was a spectacle, something worth remembering. To strip a noble of dignity was to feed the masses the illusion of justice. It reminded ordinary people that even the powerful could be destroyed. It also reminded them that the emperor stood above all. The process was systematic. When a crime was deemed offensive to the gods, the Senate, or the emperor's image, the sentence was reviewed by the praefectus orbi, the city prefect. He would determine not what kind of pain should be inflicted, but what kind of message it should send. If the empire needed unity, the punishment would be theatrical and spectacular. If it needed fear, it would be intimate and degrading. Rome knew how to turn suffering into propaganda. The tools of this system were not always physical. The Romans understood something modern societies still struggle with, that the destruction of identity can hurt far more than the destruction of the body. They created laws for it. One of the most chilling was the doctrine of infamia, loss of face. It meant a person was legally erased from civic life without being executed. They couldn't testify in court, couldn't marry, couldn't inherit property, and couldn't even be acknowledged in public. They became living ghosts, phantoms of the state. To the Romans, this was elegant justice, a way to maintain the balance between mercy and annihilation. No blood spilled, yet everything lost. The punishments themselves followed a recognizable pattern, a ritual of disgrace. It usually began with a procession through the streets, a public unveiling of the condemned. The crowd would watch as symbols of status were removed: jewelry, fine clothes, even hairstyles that denoted class. The condemned person was then displayed in a location that fit their crime: adulterers in the forum, traitors near the Senate House, blasphemers near temples. Space itself became part of the punishment. Every Roman could look at that spot and remember what happened there. There were even written guides describing how to stage these spectacles. Chroniclers like Suetonius recorded which gestures produced the strongest emotional reactions. A downcast face inspired pity. A proud look provoked anger. A sudden confession made the audience cheer. Rome had turned justice into psychological choreography, and this choreography was enforced by professionals. There were lictors, officers who carried rods and axes, responsible for maintaining the rhythm of the punishment. There were heralds who read out crimes in booming voices, and, most disturbingly, there were actors hired by the state to reenact crimes and mock the condemned, turning the pain of one person into a form of civic education. In the Roman mind, this wasn't barbarism, it was order. The philosopher Seneca wrote that punishment was the medicine of the body politic, a public cure for disobedience. But beneath this philosophy of order lay something far more dangerous: addiction. The crowds began to crave the next act of disgrace, the way they craved the next chariot race. Humiliation had become entertainment. For the state, this was convenient. The more the public enjoyed these rituals, the more the empire could justify them. People learned to cheer for degradation, to applaud the destruction of others, and to call it virtue. That was how Rome survived for centuries, not because its citizens were loyal, but because they were conditioned to fear and enjoy punishment at the same time. And so, when Aelia Varra's name was announced, the people did not see tragedy, they saw tradition. They believed they were watching justice. What they were really watching was the perfection of control. If you found this look into the darker side of Rome fascinating, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that history books often leave out. Thank you for watching. This is the punishment of Aelia Varra. Picture this: it's dawn in ancient Rome. The Campus Martis, usually a field for military exercises, is buzzing with an unusual energy. Merchants have left their stalls. Children are hoisted onto their fathers' shoulders, and even the city's slaves are craning their necks from windows. They're all waiting for a spectacle. They all want to see. In the center of the field, a low wooden platform has been erected overnight. It's not a scaffold for an execution, but something else entirely. Beside it stands a single column, a bucket of water, a small brazier, and a group of officials in stark white sashes. It's a stage, and the performance is about to begin. Two guards lead Aelia Varra out. Her once fine white tunic, a symbol of her noble status, is gone. In its place is a coarse, sand-colored wool tunic. Her long dark hair, once intricately braided, has been hacked off, hanging in uneven clumps. There are no chains, no visible wounds, just a heavy, suffocating silence. A herald steps onto the platform and unrolls a scroll. His voice, clear and amplified by the morning air, rings out across the field. Aelia Varra, daughter of Quintus Varra, guilty of impiety and insolence against the divine person of the emperor. By decree of the Senate, her body is spared, her dignity is revoked, and her name is offered to Rome for judgment. The crowd murmurs. This is what they came for. Not her death, but her complete and utter undoing. The first ritual begins, the unveiling. The guards grab the veil from her head and tear it away. Now, to a modern audience, this might seem minor, but in Rome, this act was devastating. A woman's veil was her honor, her declaration of virtue. To have it torn off in public was to strip away her identity as a wife, a daughter, a citizen. It declared that she no longer belonged to any family, any lineage, or any god. She was now nothing. Aelia's gaze remains fixed on the distant horizon. She doesn't cry, which only makes the silence feel heavier, more profound. Then comes the marking. An official dips a thin rod into a bowl of ashes and draws a dark line across her forehead. This was the *notae infamia*, the mark of dishonor. It wasn't physically painful, but its impact was permanent. Anyone who saw her from this day forward would recognize that mark and remember her public disgrace. As he draws the line, the official proclaims, "Let her carry on her face what her tongue dared to say. Let her live as proof that silence is safer than truth." The message was crystal clear. This wasn't just about punishing Aelia. It was about terrifying everyone else into submission. Next, the procession of degradation. Aelia is forced to walk slowly around the entire field, the herald following behind, repeating her sentence over and over. The crowd doesn't throw stones, that would be too merciful. Instead, they throw handfuls of dirt. It's a symbolic act, meant to lower her status, to grind her down to the level of the earth itself. Children, not fully understanding, laugh and shout insults they've overheard. Others just stare, wide-eyed, watching a woman being systematically turned into a living warning. For the Romans, humiliation wasn't just a punishment, it was a civic lesson. Every person in that crowd went home believing they had witnessed justice, learned about the importance of loyalty, and, most importantly, understood how to ensure their own safety. They would remember Aelia's face whenever they felt the urge to speak out of turn. She's brought back to the platform for the final, cruel act. An actor, hired for the occasion, steps forward. He's dressed in fine clothes, wearing a mock crown of gold-painted leaves, playing the role of arrogance. Standing right next to Aelia, he loudly mimics her supposed crime, mocking the gods in a high-pitched, foolish voice. The crowd erupts in laughter. It's theater disguised as justice. Then, in a final rehearsed moment, the herald points a dramatic finger at Aelia and shouts, "Behold, the fool who believed her words mattered." And then, it's over. There is no execution. Aelia is left kneeling on the platform as the crowd, its thirst for spectacle satisfied, slowly disperses. Her sentence is complete. She is now infamous, untrustworthy, functionally erased from society. Her father's property is confiscated. Her family is forbidden to even speak her name, and her place in the world is replaced by a void of silence. The punishment had achieved its goal perfectly. It hadn't destroyed her body. It had destroyed her meaning. In the days and weeks that followed, Aelia was seen wandering the market districts. People actively avoided her, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of fear. To acknowledge her was to invite suspicion. To help her was to risk joining her in disgrace. And so, she faded into the background of the sprawling city, a ghost, alive but unseen, a living lesson in obedience. Rome was terrifyingly efficient in this way. It didn't waste lives when it could recycle them into powerful examples. It understood that a shamed person, walking silently through the streets, was a more effective reminder to stay in line than any number of executions. The philosopher Seneca once wrote, "He who learns to fear shame will never need to fear death." He likely meant it as a lesson in personal humility. But for the Roman state, it became a manual for absolute control. By teaching its citizens to fear disgrace more than pain, more than anything, the empire built the perfect prison, one without walls, without guards, and without any hope of rebellion. Because when public humiliation is the greatest punishment, the people learn to police themselves. To truly understand why Rome relied so heavily on public humiliation, we need to get inside the Roman mind. For them, identity wasn't something you owned. It was something granted to you by the state. A Roman's worth came from public recognition, from being seen, addressed, and acknowledged. To be humiliated in public was to have that recognition revoked. It was the slow, painful erasure of a person's place within the collective story of Rome. This wasn't just punishment, it was social surgery. The Roman political system was built on performance. Senators debated in public, victorious generals paraded through the streets, and even the emperor himself relied on grand appearances to maintain authority. Power was theater, and for this theater to be convincing, the audience had to understand the rules. Public punishment, then, wasn't a flaw in the system, it was an essential part of the show. It was a stark reminder that Rome's hierarchy wasn't just about birth or blood, but about visibility. Those who pleased the state were bathed in its glory. Those who defied it were stripped of light, stripped of their name, and stripped of their very face. Psychologically, this worked because it created a fear not of death, but of exposure. In a culture obsessed with honor, where dignity was a form of currency, losing public respect was equivalent to total annihilation. The philosopher Cicero once wrote, "What is life without dignity? It is no life at all." Rome took that idea and turned it into policy. A citizen could endure torture with pride, but humiliation, that was intolerable. and that made it the perfect tool for control. The politics of humiliation extended far beyond individuals. Emperors used it to shape public opinion and silence any opposition. The Emperor Domitian was particularly fond of this method. He understood that fear was the glue that kept the elite loyal. When a senator dared to criticize him, the punishment wasn't a swift execution. It was a slow, public disgrace. The senator would be stripped of his toga, forced to stand naked before the Senate, and recite a confession of his unwavering loyalty. His property remained, his family was untouched, but his name was finished. No one would ever take his word seriously again. In the Roman world, discrediting someone was often cleaner and more effective than killing them. It erased their influence while keeping their body alive, walking, breathing, reminder of what defiance would cost. The true genius of the Roman system was that it outsourced fear. The state didn't have to chase down every rebel or dissenter. Once public humiliation became a normalized part of life, people began to censor themselves. Neighbors turned in neighbors, friends would avoid the disgraced. Even family members would pretend not to recognize those who had been marked with infamia or public shame. Social survival depended on obedience, and over time, that obedience became instinctual. Historians often describe Rome as a civilization of laws, but beneath the polished marble surface of legality lay something much darker, a culture of ritualized degradation. It was woven into every aspect of Roman life. In religion, the gods demanded submission. In politics, citizens bowed before imperial portraits, and in entertainment, crowds roared with laughter at the fallen. Humiliation wasn't just permitted, it was considered sacred. To challenge it was to challenge the divine order itself. And that's what made the system so incredibly powerful and unstoppable. By the time of the later emperors, humiliation had evolved into a full-blown performance art. Criminals were paraded through the streets, forced to reenact their crimes for cheering audiences. Those accused of impiety were dressed as mythological villains, condemned to play the role of sinners in elaborate morality plays that often ended with their real deaths. The line between punishment and theater had completely disappeared. The Romans believed this was justice made visible. A citizen watching from the stands might leave convinced that the gods had spoken, that the empire was righteous, and that order had been restored. It was, in truth, masterful propaganda spectacle that brilliantly turned cruelty into a civic virtue. But for the people at the center of it, the cruelty did not end when the ceremony was over. The humiliation lived on. It followed them everywhere, in whispered conversations, in lingering stares, in the sound of laughter that might not even be about them, but felt like it was. That was the true, terrifying genius of Rome's system. The punishment itself was temporary, but the shame was eternal. Every time someone saw a disgraced person, they were reminded to stay silent. Every time that person was ignored, the empire grew stronger. Rome didn't need legions of soldiers to patrol obedience in the streets. The people policed themselves. And perhaps that is why the Roman Empire lasted as long as it did. It wasn't just built on military discipline or brilliant strategy, it was built on deep psychological conditioning. A person wasn't destroyed for what they said. They were destroyed to teach others not to even think of saying it. Because when the fear of disgrace becomes stronger than the desire for truth, an empire doesn't need to kill to survive. It only needs to humiliate. When Aelia Varra vanished from the historical record, her story didn't just end. It fractured and multiplied into 1,000 echoes. Rome might have scrubbed her name from its official documents, but it meticulously preserved her punishment. And that very punishment, repeated over and over for centuries, became one of the Roman Empire's most enduring and darkest legacies. You see, Rome exported more than just its laws, its aqueducts, and its grand architecture. It exported ideas, and one of its most efficient exports was the idea of control through humiliation. When the Western Roman Empire finally crumbled, its vast bureaucracy didn't just evaporate, it simply changed its clothes. Roman bishops, local magistrates, and regional rulers adopted the exact same logic that had kept the empire humming for centuries. The belief that public shame was a more powerful tool for correcting behavior than any private justice. So, in medieval Europe, kings and priests began to wield these same tools of public degradation. They just gave them new names, like penance and confession. A sinner no longer had to die for their transgressions. They just needed to kneel. They needed to confess their guilt in front of everyone else. They had to accept humiliation as the first, necessary step toward their salvation. The stage had changed, but the choreography, it was identical to Rome's. Even centuries later, you can see the aftershocks of Roman humiliation everywhere. Think about the stocks in medieval towns, where offenders were locked into wooden frames, their heads and hands exposed for the public to jeer at and spit on. Think of the scarlet letters sewn onto the garments of the disgraced. Think of the forced processions of so-called heretics, paraded through city streets for all to see. None of these were medieval inventions. They were Roman habits, polished and rebranded for a new era. The Christian world gave them a new vocabulary: sin, repentance, purification, but the underlying structure was pure Roman Empire. Control through exposure, obedience through shame. And if we trace that thread even further, the same principle reappears, almost perfectly, in our modern world. We don't parade people through the Roman Forum anymore, but we absolutely destroy reputations in public. We still seem to believe, deep down, that our moral order depends on watching others fall from grace. When someone is cancelled or shamed online, when their face becomes a meme of ridicule, the pattern is disturbingly familiar. A crowd gathers. A moral accusation is leveled. The condemned is stripped not of their life, but of their credibility, their social standing. And when the ritual is finally over, they are left alive, yes, but socially erased. Rome would have understood this process perfectly. In fact, it would have admired how flawlessly the ritual still works. What Rome proved, long before psychology ever gave it a name, was that humiliation is the most economical form of power imaginable. It doesn't require vast armies or sprawling prison systems. It simply requires witnesses. The crowd itself becomes both the weapon and the prison wall. The Romans understood something fundamental about human nature. When people watch someone else being publicly shamed, they aren't just spectators, they are active participants. Every laugh, every shared post, every silent glance away confirms the social hierarchy, and every single witness learns the same unspoken rule: do whatever it takes to never be the one standing on that platform. For the empire, this was a stroke of genius. Humiliation replaced the threat of rebellion with a constant, simmering fear. It replaced the slow, messy process of justice with a quick, brutal performance. It replaced genuine morality with a shallow, performative obedience. And because it worked so incredibly well, Rome didn't need to hide its cruelty, it normalized it. By transforming punishment into a form of public entertainment, it taught generations of people to see suffering as not just necessary, but sometimes even beautiful. Aelia Varra's story is just one of countless others, forgotten because the empire wanted them forgotten. But if we listen closely, we can still hear the echoes of her footsteps on that wooden platform. We can still feel the suffocating weight of the silence that followed her name. And we can still recognize, in ourselves, the very reflex that Rome planted so deep within Western culture: the impulse to watch, to judge, and to quickly move on. That is the empire's true, lasting legacy, not its monuments, not its legions, but its absolute mastery of humiliation. History loves to remember Rome for its greatness, for its contributions to law, language, and engineering. But maybe, just maybe, the reason it lasted for so long was because it convinced the world that cruelty, when it's wrapped in ritual and ceremony, is just another word for civilization. The Colosseum may lie in ruins, but the idea that fear and shame can hold a society together, that idea is still standing, stronger than ever. And perhaps that's what makes the story of Rome not ancient history, but a mirror reflecting our own time. This was the depraved side of Roman justice, the one history books never told you about. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the darker side of Rome. If you found this exploration as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more hidden histories. We'll see you next time.